Hey everyone, welcome to Outside the Walls. My name is John White.
I'm Casey McDonald.
I'm Steve Reeves.
And we are joined today by Karl McClarty. Karl is the head preacher at the Cloverdale Church of Christ. He has been there for the last 15 years. And Karl, we're excited to have you on the show today.
Well, thanks, John. This is exciting to get together with y'all and be able to look into the future, maybe reach back a little in the past. Steve and I go way back. And
I go way back with everybody these days.
Yeah. So
I'm at that age where, I go back with everyone, it seems like.
Well, Karl, we wanted to talk with you a little bit today about small groups and how your small group system has been run at Cloverdale. You guys have seen a lot of success with that?
It has. When Larry Moran and I arrived at the same time, it was the summer of 2006, and we got to Cloverdale, and they said, we have been talking about and wanting to do small groups for a long time. We know that both of y'all did it in your previous congregations. And so we started to implement, and of course we had already had like 7 years each under our belt, and small groups morph and change. They grow. They mature, however you want to call it. There's things that typical of kicking off a small group, and then 5 years down the road, it looks different. And so for us, it was a little bit of a challenge to step back and try to remember, okay, when you start off small groups, you're trying to create a event that's off campus from the church building, and the elders, I think in a sense of wisdom, wonder, how do we manage and make sure that we are properly shepherding what is taking place, that it's going in a good direction? And so respecting that, we started off, and it was looking very much like what you would do at the church building on Sunday night. And it needed to be material that was everybody doing the same thing, everybody making sure to do communion, singing, prayer, all the typical stuff that would happen Sunday night at a building. And gradually, as you do that and you build trust in your small group leaders and the different groups that are developing, then the elders will feel more comfortable and begin to see some opportunities beyond that. And so our small groups now, back then, I can't remember if we had 12, 15, but we're up to about 22 now. And rather than being all the same thing, there's groups that are going out and visiting elderly people who are maybe shut in and doing group with them, whatever that may look like, going and singing or something. Those that might gather for doing something special with some kids in the area, or one that might be doing prayer. But a lot of them, most of them still are sort of textual or topical study-based type groups. So having done that, our numbers run about 250 to 350 through the year, and we don't do them in the summer. That's one thing that it's a preference of mine, that you don't go year-round because people will get tired.
Right.
There's a great responsibility for the host and for the leader. And sometimes that's the same person, and it can become very tiring. When you're hosting, you're running a vacuum cleaner on Sunday afternoon. You're sometimes gathering food together. You're trying to figure out how do I set up a context for the kids and for the adults? What's that going to look like? So it can be very exhausting. And my experience is, if you run through the summer, then people wear out by Christmas. But if you give them the summer off, then they come back and there's a lot of energy in the fall. Now, having said that, there are groups that are rebellious and will continue to study their Bible all through the summer. And I know. Well, churches and, studying in a hidden place in a house under oppression from the authorities, me. It sounds very Roman-esque,
I was going to say, kind of a biblical paradigm there.
So what were some of the initial difficulties when you guys started small groups? You kind of mentioned having to help shape the perspective of what is this ministry and what does it do? What are maybe some other things that you guys encountered that you kind of had to work through as a church in that first, 4 or 5 years?
Yeah, trying to trying to figure out if what was happening in the small groups was going to be consistent with the flow of the church's overall vision and what's going on at the building as well, which initially we didn't call small group, but over time they finally acquiesced and said, okay, if you're going to call us a small group, we're a small group. But the challenges initially finding material that everybody feels comfortable with if you're having to all do the same thing, and do some teaching and prepping for that. And Dan Williams, who we know from here and through preacher stuff, had some really good material, and that worked well. And for 2 years, I think it was, we did some of that. One of the challenges, and this is true of any ministry you're doing, is childcare. You're talking about a group of adults that are trying to go beyond a lecture, go beyond one person talking and everybody sitting there and just watching. You're wanting to say, hey, here's a question. This is where things get sticky in our lives. What do you do with this? Well, you don't necessarily want to do that in front of your children. So what do? Do you send them outside to play? Do you get one of the teens and pay them babysitting to teach a class, kids class? Or do you modify the material you're talking about so that the kids can be there? And of course, nowadays, in the last 5 years or so, that's intergenerational, which is real hip, right? It's what's going on. So I would say one of the biggest problems to figure out how to work is this balance between adults trying to bond on issues that are really honest Christian struggles where life meets the text, and what are we going to do with our children that's meaningful?
So what have you seen work best? You mentioned a couple of different things that you can do. What would you?
Or is that just up to each group?
Yeah, and there's been times where we've watched videos. Have you the biblical archaeology ones by Ray Vanderlyn? I don't know if you've ever seen those, but surprisingly, biblical archaeology and 5-year-olds, when it's done well, they get it. And so we've watched those and conversed, and I warned the kids before. I say, I want you to tell me something interesting, funny, whatever that you saw. So I like it best when it is that perfect intergenerational expressing and talking faith with all ages. But there are those times when you have somebody who says, let me take the kids outside and play, and that could be intergenerational too. If you've got a good Christian teenager or teenagers and they're looking after young kids, they're the cool Christian that's older, and I'm sure there's good things that are going on for them. They're not just being, killing time. And then inside, when you're able to, whoever's teaching, to stop doing the lecture thing and say, here's a question, here's the issue. We've read some verses on this. What's going on? And let the silence kind of hang out there a little bit. And then when people begin talking and getting to where they're entering each other's lives in a very, very significant way, that's the best small group, I think.
I think you make a very good point with what you just said about entering each other's lives in a very significant way. When I think about the rationale for having a small group ministry in a church, I'm reminded of the fact that in a congregation the size of Cloverdale or the size of West Side, it can be very intimidating being part of a large congregation, where it can be, if you are new, if you're a newcomer, or even if you've been there for many years and haven't really gotten involved, it can be quite intimidating to be a part of such a crowd, and a lot of people shy away from that. And so I'd like to kind of go into the idea of the why. What needs do small groups fill within a local church? What have you found to be the benefit of small groups, both individually and corporately?
Yeah. Let me back up. Kind of, you're making so many things come to mind with what you're talking about. Something that, in my understanding of small groups, I feel like it's the most natural thing that a church does. And when I say that, I mean ministry. If you look back to small country churches, a lot of times all they had to have was a guy come in, do a sermon, maybe a class, and then they were church. They knew each other. They lived close by. They went to school together, the farm together, whatever. And there was a lot of knowing who each other was. Over time, though, things began to grow. And so you hire maybe a education minister, because now we've got some kids here that we need to start getting them to learn some memory verses, do some practical steps in building their Bible knowledge. And so you add something like that. Then you begin to look around and realize that the culture is having too much influence on your teens. So you hire a youth minister. And then you realize, wait, they're going off to college, and if you're in a college town, we need to have some kind of Christian worldview that's paralleling this college experience. We need a college minister. And I know I'm touching titles that we've all held. And then, well, they got out of college and they're 30 years old, still not married. They're feeling a little lonely, thinking there's no circle for me to sort of run with. Let's get a singles minister. There's been family ministry. It just goes on and on and on. Small groups to me was there at the very beginning. It was the thing that happened when Jesus said, "Come follow me." And then he stopped at 12 as far as that official group that he called, because he wanted to work with a group where they could really get in each other's lives, see each other in the good and the bad, and wrestle with, how do you live being a follower of God, kingdom of God, in good times and bad. And yeah, he had the bigger circle of 72 that he could send out, and the larger crowds that would gather. But you always felt like those 12 were on the front row seats of the classroom. When he was talking, they were the pupils that were right there watching him. And not just what he was saying, but how is he doing this? How's he managing this crowd? How's he managing this conflict? And so I think when we go to small groups, we go back to the beginning. And that was one of the things I think that in trying to sell small groups, I kept thinking this should be easy. It should be saying to a family, all we're saying is, let's do a Thanksgiving dinner. We've always done this. You grew up knowing what it was to hold a chicken leg or a turkey leg in your hand and, eat dressing and stuff. This shouldn't be complicated. The other type of ministries, you have to put together some structure and imagine some new possibilities for some new context. Small group existed under the nose of the Roman authorities. It existed under the nose of the Sadducees and Pharisees that would persecute. It is the organization of the church that would have been just slaves and citizens who were getting off work on a Sunday, having communion, talking, getting to know each other. So to me, my basic feeling towards small groups is I shouldn't have to sell this. I shouldn't have to promote this because it's the most natural thing in the world. But because we got so into a system that was maybe like our educational system, that the tendency is it falls into a lecture format and never goes beyond that. So, and especially when you're in a college town and a lot of your small group leaders are college professors, they talk for 50 minutes or an hour and 20 minutes. And it's, you say, no, you got 5. I'll give you 10 minutes. And they're like, you're crazy. That's taking roll in class. But trying to get them to think in terms of, this is an event that's getting to know each other while we're learning the text. And it's not good enough just to get good at the text. We need each other. We need relationships that we can call on each other in tough times and be able to feel like, I trust you. I know you. Trust is, you can extend love instantly. Trust has to be earned. In small groups, you can earn trust when you're wrestling and struggling. throwing out an idea, it doesn't work, and you learn I can trust these people. They actually are willing to go with me on this and still be my friends, as silly as my ideas are maybe sometimes. And I think it becomes a glue that allows everything else that we do at church to go smoothly.
I agree. Mm-hmm. I remember an illustration that was used by Willard Tate many years ago in a book entitled Learning to Love. You may have read it. But he talked about watching a documentary on TV about little chicks that had been hatched and were being sized and sorted to be sent out to the chicken farms where they would be raised. And they were coming down this conveyor belt, this mass of chicks, and they were being graded according to size and color. And those that didn't measure up were actually carried off the end of a conveyor belt into a crusher where they were just crushed. And he said that in the scene that he was watching, one of these chicks had not been chosen by any of the selectors, and it got to the end of the conveyor belt and it turned around and started running back. And it was running from person to person like, would you accept me? Would you take me? Would you take me? Until finally the conveyor belt just overtook its little legs and it was carried off into the crusher. But to me, the beauty of a small group, we have people that come into our congregations that are a lot like the little chick, and they are looking for acceptance. They're looking for someone who will befriend them, someone with whom they can develop a meaningful relationship. And so often they run from person to person, perhaps, or maybe they don't know who to run to. But the small group gives people an opportunity to find their importance and their significance, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point. There is a question when a church talks about we do small groups is, are you a church of small groups, or are you a church that does small groups? Are you a small group church, or are you a church that does small groups? And if you already have, you're organized and you're doing church for some time, and then you choose to do small groups, you'll forever be a church that does small groups, most likely. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's what we are. But when people start churches with small groups, and small groups are the core on which everything is built, then they become a church of small groups. I think there's a lot to be said for that situation. We've typically allowed Sunday school to be the place where you catch people, the safety net of they've not been here for 2 weeks. Has anybody seen them? We've tried to do it in auditorium, and I've seen some of that where you try to take the attendance cards and sort through and figure out who wasn't there and stuff, but that can be very tedious, and oftentimes you miss somebody. But if we ever had it where the small groups could account for most of the folks in the congregation, the ability to catch those chicks before they go getting ripped off the belt and thrown into the crusher, I think there would be a really high success rate for holding on to people, catching them in their moment of trouble.
So are people assigned? I mean, is the best practices for a church that is going to do small groups, for a church that's existing, as far as getting people involved in it, would the best practices be to assign everybody to a group to make sure that everybody kind of, has some form of accountability, or do you just let these form organically and just encourage everybody to, get involved in one?
Yeah. Because if you assign, that would help the person who shows up and doesn't necessarily have a friend group already in place. There's something to be said for that. On the other hand, if you tell people what small group to go to, they'll go to their group that they want to go to. Right. There's a few people that are, duty before dishonor, but most people are like, nah, I'll go with my friends. And this brings up an interesting point. What happens when you've gotten to know your group really well, and it's time for you to sort of expand your friend group? Would it not be the perfect thing to think, let's do a fruit basket turnover, let's shuffle it all up, and you get to know some more people next year, and then the next year, and maybe in about 6-7 years, you'll feel pretty comfortable having a conversation with most of the folks at church. You figure it out and you tell me how, I have tried and I've tried. Another thing about small groups, and part of it is because your success becomes your Achilles heel. You get really connected to a small group, and especially if you're not a real extroverted kind of person, you're going to say, this is my group. I don't want to leave my group. And with small groups, the theory is that the 22 at Cloverdale, once they've expanded, here's a funny thing. We call them small groups. We have small groups that are bigger than a lot of churches in other states on Sunday morning.
So there's not really a cap.
Yeah. I mean, we've had 70 in a small group.
Oh,
it's
my.
like, by definition, you can no longer be in my small group ministry. You're starting a large group ministry.
You're a congregation
that's
on
right.
yourself.
So ideally, those 22 should maybe split in half and have 44 now. And wow, what a benefit you could do. But you can try different language like, well, we're not splitting, we're multiplying. We are spinning off new groups. But I have been in groups and people crying, and you try to pass a hat around and pull names out to see who gets caught in the draft.
Short straw.
Lots,
I've seen it where you say, let's divide up town. Y'all, this group, y'all are from the east side and you are from the west side, so let's go our separate ways. And then the ladies go into the kitchen and the men stand there going, we did it, man. We are the dudes. And the ladies are in there saying, those guys are crazy. And this will never stand. So
that is another podcast on the subject of church trauma.
So we are not that podcast.
So trying to figure out what the ideal is and what actually can work oftentimes just falls out to if you can get a few courageous folks who want to step out and start a new group, that's great. Last year we had 4 folks I was really proud of them. They stepped up and said, we love our groups, but we're going to start 4 new ones. We just need 4 more. And they did. And sure enough, people came, it formed up, but it takes some real courage and real guts to do that.
So correct me if I'm wrong, Karl, but give me your thoughts on this idea. The bigger a church gets, the more important it is to be intentional about making it smaller, about dividing, not dividing, but giving opportunity for people to come into a small setting, because there's something that can be deeply intimidating about, say, a 400 or 500 member church. Walking in there, you're like, I don't know anybody. But the small group is immediately, if you know one person there, that small group is immediately a way to kind of get a base of people that you know. And yet, the bigger that it gets, the harder it is for us to do small groups. The more we resist wanting to change that, because especially if you grew up from a smaller church perspective, it's like, well, this is what we do. We all come together. Like, we don't want to lose anybody, but really we are losing people when we don't take the time to do that well and to kind of divide up. I know that Jesse and I came into, we were at Cloverdale for several years back when I was an intern there, and we didn't really know anybody other than the teen parents. So we had some connections with the teen parents, but they weren't our age. They weren't like our peers. They were just people that we were familiar with and knew well. And then we got invited to a small group. And that's when Cloverdale was it kind of became not just a church and not just a place that we went to, but it really felt like family. That was the change that happened after we joined that small group. And I'll never forget that moment of having a place every Sunday night to go to that was smaller, that I could meet guys my age and talk about scripture and grow and learn and feel like, hey, if something's wrong, I know who to go to. I know what to do about that.
Yeah. You were making me think of my sermon when last fall, because of COVID, I said, this fall, think small. And it was partly because with COVID, big crowds were no longer an option, and maybe we'll have some other stuff that will prevent us from having the big group, but nothing can stop you from having just a few folks get together for a Bible study. Right. You can do that anywhere. And so, yeah, there's a quality of, just being able to talk about discipleship type issues things that are serious, things that are convicting, things that are they give you strength to be able to face what you're dealing with. And nothing, I don't think anything is as much benefit as small groups were and are.
You mentioned in the beginning anyway, the need to have kind of universal study material for each of the small groups. From the sounds of it, it's not necessarily that way now. Right. So what was the, I guess, intention of doing that originally, and how did that kind of evolve to it being okay, I guess, for each group to do their own thing?
One of the challenges, I'll say, initially was elders wanting small groups, but not necessarily wanting to go be in the small groups. But they knew it was something that a lot of folks had talked about. This looked like it would help. So in both churches where I was at, the majority of the elders would stay at the building with that small group. Like I say, we didn't call them that to their face, but that was the small group at the building. And then there's the other groups. And that just sort of increases the sense of what's going on out there, and we need reports. We need to know there's some degree of health and soundness in what's going on, lest we find ourselves in a situation where we've got somebody teaching some stuff that's not healthy, So I respect that. I respect what the elders are wrestling with. You're trying to give freedom, just like a parent. You want to give freedom to your child. At the same time, you don't want them jumping in the car with some rough crowd going to rough places. You want to figure out how to do that. The only thing that seems to solve that is time, and some of those elders deciding to go visit the small groups. And together, it takes a long time, it takes many years. There begins to be this sense of confidence in the teachers themselves, teachers in the material, and as the person who has been that point person, oftentimes, me talking to each of those small groups and figuring out what they're doing and being able to report anytime I'm asked, individually more oftentimes, what's going on in that group? Oh, they're studying this material. Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. So what I did after a while, once we were told we could expand our offerings and allow different groups to do different things, I built a library. And I started out with books, stuff that everybody feels pretty safe with, but also challenging, like maybe some C.S. Lewis stuff, or if it's Christian evidences, maybe some material that folks would know of. And then over time, I began to get VHS tapes. And then we stepped it up to DVDs.
Man.
The small groups went to a whole new level at that point. But there was a sense in which our folks just didn't know what was out there. I don't know if you remember the days before the internet, but there was a thing called the CBD catalog, Christian Book Distributors.
Christian Book Distributors.
And we, the high priest, the preachers, we had CBD, and a lot of the other folks were like, "What? Where's the books at?"
That's something different nowadays, CBD.
Oh, okay. You're right. So I would flip through and see what was out there and names that friends had recommended, or I had seen at seminars, or talking with other preachers. And by building a library, that gave a certain degree of confidence both in the teachers, who would just walk in and say, and I would print out a directory of all the possibilities, and sometimes they would just come through and look through the shelves. And it was just for small groups, a small group library. And that worked really well. And the elders, if they were wondering, could come and look and sort of see what we had as well. And that built trust and confidence, and conversations would come out of that. So now it seems as though we're moving to one more level, and that is with things like Right Now Media. You have a whole platform of a bazillion Christian videos that are out there, and trying to figure out exactly how to sort of coach and help. One of the nice things that Right Now Media lets us do is have our own Cloverdale page, and we can populate it with stuff that we like. So in a sense, you have the capacity to build your own library, and then you could even upload some of your own videos and say, here's a Casey McDonald
Nice.
dealing with, politics and the present crisis, and you can do that, and your folks can be at home, pull it up, everybody watch the video and have a conversation. So I'm kind of excited and a little bit nervous about this, the new explosion of opportunities and stuff in videos.
Karl, I'm wondering, what are some of the obstacles that you have encountered, first of all, in forming a small group program or ministry, if you want to call it ministry or program? And secondly, what are some of the obstacles that you face in maintaining it and keeping it fresh?
There are two philosophies on the length of time that a small group should be. There's a theory, this is mine, I'm on this side, that says people's time is valuable. It's Sunday night. Tomorrow is Monday morning. School, work, all that. And so you recognize an hour and they're out. Make sure they know that they can be out in an hour. And so that's what I preach, although not all of my small group leaders recognize me as the canon, And so there is this other philosophy, and I respect it, though it's not mine, that says small group is a place you just need to take your time and you need to really just visit as long as you can and let people, stay. And in fact, it's even better if you eat. Now, I didn't run into this as much where I used to be, but boy, Cersei, eating while you're doing small group, it's almost a law. And I tell people, no, because the poor folks that are putting on the food will just, after a while, just get exhausted. They'll say, we cook all Sunday afternoon, we clean, or part of the family's cleaning, part's cooking. Then we have to clean up after everybody's left. We are bailing out of small groups. We're quitting. And I'll say, no, just don't feed them. And they'll say, no, we have to. And I'll say,
this is the South.
Yes. So there is the culture of hospitality that sometimes shipwrecks small group because it demands too much of the people whose house it's in. Where if you're going to church, the custodian will show up on Monday and take care of cleaning up, and everybody can go home. But it is a very physically demanding,
it's a very
and sometimes
good point.
Financially.
Very good point.
So I don't say one's right or wrong, but I do preach my gospel, and I let the other folks, if they want to do it, that's fine. Another problem is burnout due to just as time goes on, and I tell them take the summer off, and oftentimes they refuse, and then after sometime during the next year, they'll burn out and quit. So trying to get folks to have realistic expectations of what they can do, and realizing people will use you up. Some people, if you don't set some boundaries. And so I tried to, as the small group guy, set some social boundaries to protect my valuable assets of host, hostess, teacher. I want those people to stay energized, committed, and feel like they're also having their needs met of a reasonable expectation and their commitment to this. So that's one of the biggest battles I fight.
Are the groups recurring year after year, or are they kind of developed afresh each year?
There is a certain group that will come back each year. They don't necessarily forever and always, but you do have some people that hit a stride and they've got a small group. And so the individuals that come into that group can change over, but that group stays on and on. It's that's an interesting question, because your teachers, there's some people that know how to teach small group style, ask questions and listen and engage. And then there's those that just teach all the time. And the teaching doesn't get the job done nearly so well. but it doesn't mean that they won't sometimes outlive the others.
I'm curious about something. You guys do your small groups on Sunday nights. Is there any logic to doing it on Sunday versus Wednesday, or was that just what made the most sense to you guys? Or is there something that kind of universally why that night makes more sense or less sense than Wednesday if somebody does it differently?
Yeah. At risk of showing our cards too much, it seems that Sunday night oftentimes just doesn't have the energy that Sunday morning has. When you're preaching Sunday night, you can feel it. When you're leading singing, you just feel it. And so I think Sunday night was the obvious space for something needs to be done. What is that? How can we step in and provide something more meaningful? Wednesday night, I've never been at a church that it wasn't hopping and jumping and kids were loving it. And I will say that I was at a church where we were building a new church building. And so we sold our building, and for a year we were transients between two places. The new building's not built yet, the old one's not there. So the local school let us come over on Sunday mornings. But we didn't have Sunday night and we didn't have Wednesday night. And people would regularly tell me how they grieved over the loss of Wednesday night. I never had anybody ever ask me, could you figure a way for us to do, now we had some small groups going on, but as far as get back to the building, do this thing that we've always done at the building. And I don't think it was my bad preaching, okay? I think I feel like there's a sense in which Sunday is so exciting and fulfilling in the morning. You come together, and if you stand around and talk and visit later, and then you eat with friends, especially if you have them over the house or you go to their house, or maybe you just hang out at the restaurant for a long time. You run home and you're tired, and Sunday night is not something that you wake up and say, hey, we got to get back up there. I'm hungry. It's like, no, I've been fed. I've been fed to overflowing. I have more thoughts in my head after the experiences of this morning and this table fellowship with friends than I could possibly process for the next 2 or 3 days. So I think that's the reason Sunday nights, and that's just being very frank. I know
that's great.
It probably sounds almost rude, but it's being a preacher, I feel like I can say that about my own preaching.
No, if we can't be honest at the church, where can we be honest?
I think Wednesdays don't need help. I think Wednesdays there's a lot of people that give a lot. Kids are ready. People have been beat up by life and they're looking for that engagement at church. But Sunday night, you're coming right off of, a buffet, and it's kind of like eating, back to the Thanksgiving analogy. What do you eat that night? Turkey dressing again. I'm stuffed. It's good stuff, Mom. Really, no offense, Grandma. But so I think small groups allow us a chance to kind of, in a more relaxed sense, do some processing together. And I like to think that they're saying in these small groups, Carl in his sermon this Sunday said something that was really this morning, he said something that was really valuable. Let's talk about that. I don't know if it actually happens, but I'd like to think it does.
I was actually kind of curious about that and about to ask, do you ever try to do something like that where you maybe, if you ever did or have recently, do you ever do something where you try to encourage small groups, they're happening that night, you're preaching, you're going through something, and you say, hey, I would love for you guys to discuss this further tonight, where you make a connection between those two?
Yes, and I have done that years where whenever I'm making my sermon, when I finish it, I make up discussion questions, and I sort of steal from the serendipity type Bible studies. I don't know if you've ever used those, where it's icebreaker, dig deeper, reflect. And I write my own questions out of the Sunday morning sermon. And I feel like when I've listened to a sermon, I'm ready to talk with some other people about what I've heard, but we never give that outlet. So
I think that's a very valid comment. So often, one of the ways you internalize a message is by talking about it. And we really do not give people an opportunity to respond, to talk one-on-one about what they have heard. And as a result, somebody said, if you want to humble a preacher, just have him ask people what he spoke about last Sunday.
Yeah.
A lot of people won't remember, but when you've had the opportunity to follow up in a smaller setting and to discuss that, it really does help to internalize the message and to flesh things out somewhat.
What correlation have you seen with small groups and church growth and or evangelistic efforts?
Evangelistic efforts, I feel like it's an entry point in theory, and I think it does serve that way if you have some people in the small group that are reaching out to friends. It won't just happen, and there's some groups that don't necessarily go looking for folks on the outside. And one thing that makes it challenging is if it's a person who's coming in and they've not been exposed to Scripture before, and you're trying to have a basic principles kind of conversation, then that can be kind of awkward if maybe you invite somebody new in 2 weeks and then this person's ready to move to another place, and it's kind of like you're forever trying to kick off a class but never able to get it finished. And so, and people can feel intimidated if they're the only person that hadn't had the class. Everybody else is a repeat. So it's challenging, but there's people that have been able to do that successfully. And then and as far as growth, one thing we did notice was our Sunday night attendance as we tracked it, as it would drop down to where half of your people that were there on Sunday morning have come back for Sunday night, and then sometimes it drops to a third of that number. Most everybody feels that same kind of effect. When we did small groups, we found that we bounced way back up. Really? There is a much more greater interest in folks saying, oh, okay, that would be something that could be meaningful to me and my kids, and that could be an opportunity that's more relaxed, more give and take, rather than sitting and listening. I don't know about you, Steve, but a lot of times my Sunday night sermons had to run longer than the Sunday morning just because the hour you didn't have as much going on. The communion didn't take as much time. The song leader is singing with people that are tired, and so they don't lead as many, and so you're like, okay, then the sermon's going to need to go from 25 minutes to 35 minutes, and everything kind of becomes sort of a self-defeating kind of.
Well, it's something people are not aware of many times of what's going on in a speaker's mind, and also physiologically. When you are gearing up for a large assembly of people on Sunday morning, your body begins producing adrenaline. And all of us, and all four of us here, have spoken on occasions. And for me, it starts on Saturday. Saturday is like winding up the spring for me. And by the time Saturday night is here, I'm wound up and don't sleep well. I get up, crack of dawn Sunday morning, my body is like a spring that is wound up. And when you get up on Sunday morning and you expend that energy, it is like letting a spring just completely explode, and your body is just zapped. Mind, body, everything. And it is very difficult from a speaker's standpoint to repeat that process for Sunday night. Now, that is just the long and the short of it. You may be well prepared. You may have your sermon well prepared. I try to do my Sunday night presentations before I do my Sunday morning. So I'm not caught at the last minute. But I'm just saying it is difficult from a speaker standpoint to generate the same level of enthusiasm on a Sunday night that you do on the Sunday morning. And it's not because it's not good material or anything else. A lot of it is physiological in nature.
And just to clarify something you said just a second ago, Carl, you said your attendance went up. You mean when you're counting all of your small groups as a part of your Sunday evening crowd.
Correct.
So you're seeing this growth, and maybe that's something that initially churches struggle with when they're thinking about a small group system is, well, this seems like we're going to have less people here, not more. But when you consider that means that someone's coming back to be fed in a different way, they're being counted as a part of what we're doing. And so would it be better for them to try to come back on a Sunday night for the normal service? Or, if they decide, I don't want to do that, but I'll come to a small group, you're getting a second chance to sort of do something valuable with that member where you might not get them at all. So if you start counting everybody together, you're not losing people, you're gaining people.
Right. So yeah, 250 at the building, then you leave 50 and 200 go out, but they pick up another 100 that just wasn't engaged at all on Sunday night. So it is pretty exciting to think all those folks that you could call them friends, you could call them just checked out for other reasons, re-engaged, reconnected, a part of something that's pretty exciting. So,
what about your group that meets at the building, Carl? What do they do? Are they more of a traditional service, or is it a Bible class, Bible study? You mentioned a moment ago the small group that meets that really doesn't want to be known as a small group. But what about those folks?
They kept somewhat traditional for a while, but over time, partly because of speakers that would be brought in, that if I wasn't preaching there and we were bringing in some other folks, members that are also Bible faculty at Harding, that kind of thing, they would say, could I do this more as a class? Would that be okay? And gradually sort of won them over to this idea of turning it into really more of like a Sunday, what you'd call Sunday morning Bible class, auditorium Bible class. Still doing the singing, so it's a hybrid. It feels kind of like a typical Sunday night, but it also has a little more of give and take, because there's a lot of benefit when you can ask a question and people are feeling like they're a part of what's happening.
Well, Carl, I mean, this has been a fantastic conversation about small groups. I think we learned quite a bit more than we thought we would too. So we're excited. We're so thankful that you came on the show today. Really glad that you're a part of this. If you guys out there have any questions for Carl or questions for us, you can always send those questions over to us. Questions@wschurch.net. Just send us an email, and we'll relay those to Carl, or we can answer those on another show.
Can I mention one last thing?
Go for it.
The Cloverdale exists because of West Side. I don't know if y'all know that, but there was a Cloverdale zone.
In a good way or a bad way?
You gave birth to us. You remember the old days of zones? Did y'all have zones?
We had zones.
Yes, we did. We did up until just a few years ago.
Yeah, we defined our church family by geographic locations about town, and that was the zones. Well, there was a West Side Church of Christ zone called the Cloverdale Zone, and the Rogers and the Whites and the Pierces were sitting in that zone meeting, and they said, there should be a church over here on this side of town. Well, in a sense, they were a subset of, West Side, but they, in their model of how they understood best to carry that out, they came to the West Side elders and said, what do you think? And they said, that sounds good. And they even felt the obligation to go and talk to the downtown and college church elders and said, there's no hard feelings here, but we've begun to define ourselves as being able to have a ministry on the east side of town at Cloverdale, in that area around there, and we would just love to have everybody's, prayers and support. And so it got kicked off, and on July the 4th, 1976, very patriotic sort of day, the West Siders started that, and I would say they started it out of a small group, though they didn't know to call it that. They just called it the Cloverdale Zone.
Well, I came to Searcy in the fall of '77, so I knew that Cloverdale was fairly new congregation, but I didn't know some of those details. And it's interesting because West Side, in a similar way, came from the college church back in 1959, when a group of people from college church, completely agreeable with the college elders, they simply said, there needs to be a congregation over on what was then the west side of town. We're not very west side anymore now, but anyway, and so it's interesting now to learn the rest of that story.
So small groups, church planting,
church planting.
Hand in hand.
There you go. Well, we're so glad that you guys have joined us today, and we hope that y'all have a fantastic evening.